Imagine stepping into a quiet church before sunrise, the icons dimly glowing, the incense settling in the air like a gentle reminder that holiness still breathes among us. Today, I want to take you on a journey into the one of the most tender, mysterious, and important feasts of the Christian year, the entry of the Mother of God into the temple. This is not only a moment from history, it is the moment the world began to breathe differently, the moment humanity offered God a heart so pure that he could finally enter creation as one of us. This feast is the doorway to the Incarnation, the quiet beginning of God's loudest act of love. And if we listen carefully, this story becomes a mirror reflecting what God desires to do in our lives as well. The story begins with two elderly, righteous parents, Joachim and Anna, who carried the heavy burden of childlessness. Yet instead of turning their sorrow into bitterness, they lifted it to God with trust, prayer, and perseverance. They lived the truth expressed in Psalm 1, which teaches that the blessed person refuses to walk in the counsel of the ungodly or stand in the path of spiritual corruption. In their grief, they could have abandoned faith, but instead, they held on even more tightly. This is the first lesson of the feast. Holiness begins where trust outlasts pain. Their prayer was heard, and the Archangel Gabriel appeared, announcing that they would conceive a child who would be spoken of throughout the whole world. This child was Mary. And when she reached the age of 3, her parents remembered the vow they made, that if God granted them a child, they would dedicate her entirely to him. They brought her to the temple with reverence, gratitude, and tears, because although they loved their child deeply, they loved God more. The mystery of the feast unfolds from that moment. Mary ascended the temple steps with a purity that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Tradition tells us that she climbed the steps without turning back, as if drawn upward by an invisible hand. Her heart was already inclined toward God, already seeking the one who had fashioned her for a holy purpose. Psalm 1 describes such a person, one whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates on it day and night. Mary's entire being was oriented toward God long before she understood the full magnitude of her calling. The feast of the entry, reveals something essential. God prepares his greatest work slowly, quietly, and through the cooperation of human freedom. Because it's a gift from God. Mary does not enter the temple merely as a symbolic act, but as a revelation of how God patiently shapes the human heart. Inside those sacred walls, she would learn prayer, silence, humility, and obedience. Holiness is not improvised. It is cultivated. And through her, God begins preparing the world for the birth of his Son. The Fathers teach that Mary was uniquely chosen, not because she was exempt from human nature, but because she used her freedom perfectly. She grew up in a fallen world just like every other human being, yet she did not allow sin to take root in her heart. She chose the good freely, constantly, and joyfully. This is why she became the vessel through which God would renew creation. Her entry into the temple marks the beginning of this extraordinary cooperation between divine grace and human freedom. Inside the temple, Mary lived not as a visitor, but as a participant in the divine mystery. The fathers say that angels ministered to her, teaching her hymns, enlightening her soul, and preparing her for the greatest announcement in human history. Every experience she had there shaped her ability to hear God's voice with absolute clarity. This formation teaches us that sanctity requires discipline. It is a life of listening more than speaking, receiving more than asserting. Her entrance into the temple is also the restoration of what humanity lost in Eden. The fall of Adam and Eve was caused not simply by disobedience, but by the desire to live apart from God, to redefine existence on their own terms. The serpent's whisper offered the illusion of autonomy, and humanity embraced it. Mary reverses this moment completely. Through her entry, humanity returns to God, offering him the freedom he gave us in the beginning. Psalm 1 speaks powerfully here, saying that the righteous person becomes like a tree planted by streams of water, whose leaf does not wither and who bears fruit in its season. Mary is this tree. She draws her life from God alone, and the fruit she will bear is Christ himself. Her leaf does not wither because she never allows sin to choke the life of grace within her. Through her, we see the full flourishing of human nature restored to God. At the same time, the psalm contrasts the righteous with those who separate themselves from God, saying they become like chaff driven by the wind. Such people lack spiritual weight and grounding. They are blown from desire to desire, from idea to idea, never find rest or purpose. The feast places Mary in contrast to this ruthlessness. She is anchored, steady, and unshakable. Her life in the temple shows us that true freedom is not noise, but stability. Even the structure of the temple reflects her destiny. The Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary, symbolized God's presence and was entered only by the high priest. Yet tradition tells us that Mary was brought into this sacred space by the high priest, who was inspired to recognize in her something extraordinary. She did not enter as a violation of the law, but as its fulfillment. The temple was not merely a building for her. It was a prophecy. It was a prophecy of her own heart. Once inside, Mary blossomed in the presence of God. She learned the rhythms of prayer, the meaning of silence, and the beauty of Scripture. Her mind was shaped by divine wisdom rather than the patterns of the world. She lived as the person Psalm 1 describes, one whose delight is in God and whose roots go down deep into the soil of grace. Her entry, therefore, not only symbolic, it is transformative. The fathers emphasize that God never overwhelms human freedom, even when planning the salvation of the world. The Incarnation required Mary's full cooperation. Willing, let it be unto me. Her time in the temple prepared her for this sacred moment. She learned to say yes through thousands of small acts of surrender, long before the angel ever appeared. This reveals the beauty and dignity of the human will aligned with God. Mary's holiness does not diminish her humanity, it magnifies it. She is not a distant figure, but the first fully healed human being, the first to live in complete harmony with God. Her purity does not isolate her from the world, but equips her to bring healing to it. She becomes the bridge between heaven and earth. Through her entry, humanity begins to cross that bridge again. The feast also reveals that holiness is a journey that begins early but is never forced. Mary enters the temple freely, joyfully, and with her whole heart. She becomes the living model of Psalms 1 final words, that God knows the way of the righteous, and this path leads to life. Her every step toward the temple is a step toward her vocation, and her vocation becomes the salvation of the world. Inside the temple, Mary embodied a new form of human life. She was fully attentive, fully available, fully receptive to God's presence. She carried no internal noise, no competing desires, no divided loyalties. Her life was simple in the most profound sense. It belonged wholly to God. And through her, God could finally enter the world without resistance. Her entry announces the beginning of a new covenant, one not based on stone tablets, but on a living heart. The temple prepared her to become the true Holy of Holies, the dwelling place of the eternal Word. In her womb, heaven and earth would meet. Through her, humanity would become capable of bearing God. And this possibility begins with her first small steps into the temple. The feast shows that salvation is never forced, but always invited. God could have saved the world through sheer power, but he chose instead to work through the free cooperation of a young girl. Her freedom becomes the foundation of the Incarnation. Her purity becomes the safeguard of the mystery, and her entry becomes the opening chapter of redemption. Every aspect of the feast teaches us about the greatness of human potential when God and humanity collaborate. Mary's willingness becomes the key that unlocks the gates of heaven. Her silence becomes the atmosphere where the word can speak. Her humility becomes the ground where divine grace can take root, and her love becomes the light that guides the entire church. But this feast is also a personal challenge. Mary entered the temple at 3 years old. We enter it whenever we decide to let God lead us. The temple she entered becomes the inner temple we must build within ourselves. Holiness begins with a small step, maybe unsure, maybe trembling, but in the right direction. And God meets us there with patience and tenderness. The church responds to her entry with a hymn that expresses centuries of gratitude. We shall not keep silent, Mother of God, from proclaiming your power. This is not mere poetry. It is the recognition that her yes changed the destiny of the world. If she had not offered herself, the world would not have received the Savior. Her entry becomes the turning point in human history. Her entry becomes the turning point in human history. And through her intercession, that turning continues in our own hearts. The prayer continues. If you had not stood before God on our behalf, who would have delivered us from so many dangers? Mary's presence in the temple is already the beginning of her intercession for humanity. She stands before God not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Her love for God becomes her love for us. And her entry teaches us that every act of holiness has a ripple effect far beyond what we can see. The final words of the prayer are tender and powerful. We shall not depart from you, Lady, for you always deliver your servants from all their needs. This expresses the heart of Christian faith. Mary does not replace Christ. She brings us to Him. She does not hide God's glory. She reveals it. And her entry becomes the assurance that God is preparing a path for each of us. For each of us. So, what does this feast ask of us? It asks us to take our first step toward God. It asks us to enter our own inner temple, no matter how messy, noisy, or discouraged we may feel. It asks us to cultivate silence, to listen before we speak, and to trust before we understand. To trust before we understand. Mary's entry is not just her story. It is our invitation, and the God who welcomed her will welcome us. The feast also teaches us that the spiritual life is not built on moments of emotion but on steady faithfulness. Joachim and Anna prayed for years before receiving Mary. Mary spent years in the temple before receiving the Annunciation. And Christ himself lived 30 years in hiddenness before beginning his ministry. God forms greatness slowly but thoroughly. Psalm 1 returns again as a blueprint for this feast. The one who avoids the counsel of the ungodly discovers clarity. The one who delights in God's law finds stability. The one who roots themselves in God becomes fruitful. The one who walks the righteous path discovers joy. And Mary embodies all of this. Perfectly. Her entry teaches us that when we give God even the smallest opening, He fills it with grace beyond measure. She offered Him her childhood, her mind, her silence, her willingness, and God filled her with everything heaven could give. She becomes the new Eve, the healed humanity, the living temple, the mother of the Messiah. And all of this begins with her step into the temple. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her footsteps echoing across the centuries. They are the steps of freedom returning to God. They are the steps of creation moving toward redemption. They are the steps of hope entering history. And they are the steps that guide our feet toward the same mystery. So today, as we honor this feast, we stand on holy ground. We are not remembering a distant story, but entering its meaning. Mary's entry is a promise that God is still writing His story in human hearts. Her life shows that holiness is possible, and her witness shows that holiness is beautiful. The feast ends with a simple but life-changing invitation. Enter the temple, enter the silence, enter the presence of God. Offer Him your heart. Not perfect, not polished, but sincere. And let Him do what he did through Mary. And let him do what he did through Mary. Transform the world, beginning with you. Thank you very much. See you next time. Peace.